stood alone in the fields, framed by trees that seemed to murmur secrets whenever the wind passed through. Exhausted from a day of unpacking and scrubbing away years of abandonment, Emma and Daniel tried to settle in. To Emma, the house felt off, as though its silence hid something it didn't want them to find. Daniel dismissed her unease with a laugh. "It's just dust and old memories, love. Soon this will feel like home." Emma nodded but didn't argue. Instead, her eyes drifted toward the windows that groaned softly in their frames, though there was no breeze. She tried to ignore the way shadows seemed to linger too long in the corners of the rooms. That night, Emma woke suddenly. The house's silence wasn't comforting. It pressed in on her, heavy and deliberate. Careful not to wake Daniel, she slipped out of bed to fetch a glass of water. At the sink, she heard it, a low, drawn-out sigh emanating from the walls. Her grip on the glass tightened, her hands trembling. Perhaps it was old pipes, she reasoned. But the sound wasn't metallic or mechanical. It was organic, almost human. Her gaze shifted to the pantry door. It was ajar. Emma was certain she'd closed it earlier. Summoning courage, she approached, the cold floor biting at her bare feet. The darkness within seemed to pulse with the sound. "It's just the wind," she whispered, though she knew the wind couldn't reach that place. She shut the door firmly and returned to bed, but the whisper stayed with her, thrumming in her mind like an unanswered question. The next morning she told Daniel. He dismissed it with a chuckle over his coffee. "You're overthinking, Emma. Old houses creak and groan. It's nothing." It wasn't just a sound, Daniel. It was breathing. Something or someone. He teased with a grin, but Emma didn't answer. She knew how ridiculous it sounded. That evening, Emma stayed up reading, trying to distract herself. The fire crackled softly. The clock chimed 11:45 p.m., and the house was still. But then she felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. The sound returned. No longer confined to the walls, it drifted from the hallway near the kitchen, a faint scratching noise followed by another sigh. Emma froze, her book slipping from her hands. The pantry door was open again. Emma woke the next morning feeling a weight pressing on her chest, as though something unseen had been sitting on her while she slept. Morning light crept through the curtains, but it brought little comfort. Outside, the day appeared serene. Birds chirped. The wind played in the trees. But inside, the house was steeped in an unnatural stillness. Daniel was already in his makeshift office down the hall, typing furiously. Emma descended the stairs toward the kitchen, but froze on the last step. A single plate rested on the counter, its surface smeared with leftover food. She frowned. They had cleaned everything the night before. "Daniel?" she called, trying to keep her voice steady. "Did you come down here last night?" "What?" His voice was muffled. "No, I was asleep. Why?" Emma didn't answer. Instead, she put the plate away, brushing off the creeping chill that threatened to take hold of her. Over the week, the disturbances grew. Items Emma distinctly remembered putting away would reappear elsewhere. The pantry door was perpetually ajar, no matter how many times she closed it. Daniel dismissed her concerns with logical explanations. "Maybe you're distracted," he said, wrapping an arm around her. "Or we've got mice. That's probably it." But Emma wasn't convinced. Determined to prove she wasn't imagining things, she locked the pantry door with a rusty chain she'd found in the basement. Before bed, she meticulously arranged 3 glasses on the counter and memorized their positions. When the clock struck 3:17 a.m., she awoke to the now familiar sound of faint scratching and dragging noises. She slipped out of bed quietly, her pulse quickening as she descended the stairs. The hallway seemed longer in the dark, its shadows shifting with each step she took. When she reached the kitchen, her breath caught. 2 glasses remained exactly where she had left them. The third lay shattered on the floor, shards gleaming faintly in the dim light. Emma's eyes darted to the pantry. The chain was intact, but the door itself appeared warped, as though something inside had been pushing against it. She thought about opening it, but stopped herself. The air felt different, thick and heavy, charged with a presence she couldn't explain. She backed away slowly, her heart pounding in her ears. The next morning, Emma showed Daniel the broken glass and explained what had happened. This time he didn't laugh. Instead, a shadow of unease flickered across his face. "We'll set up cameras," he said, his voice firm. "If something's happening, we'll catch it." That night, Daniel positioned cameras in the living room, kitchen, and hallway. They watched the live feed on Daniel's laptop, forcing themselves to stay awake as the hours dragged on. For a long time, nothing happened. The screens displayed nothing but the stillness of the house. Then, at 3:17 a.m., something stirred. A shadow darted across the kitchen. It moved too quickly to be fully seen, a blur that sent a chair toppling over. Daniel rewound the footage, but when they played it back, the shadow was gone. Only the fallen chair remained. "It's probably a glitch," Daniel muttered, though the tension in his voice betrayed him. The following night, Daniel decided to stay awake alone. "If there's something here," he said, "I want to see it myself." Emma tried to dissuade him, but his resolve was unwavering. At 3:10 a.m., Emma awoke to the sound of a muffled shout. She bolted downstairs to find Daniel standing in the kitchen, pale and trembling, the laptop open on the counter. "Daniel, what is it?" He pointed at the screen, his hand shaking. Emma leaned in to look. This time, the shadow on the recording was more distinct. Its shape was vaguely human, but its edges wavered, like smoke. It drifted toward the pantry, and as it passed, the chain rattled violently before the door flew open on its own. Before Emma could speak, the pantry door in the kitchen slammed shut with a deafening bang. Both froze. Neither dared to approach. Emma barely slept that night. She and Daniel sat frozen in the kitchen until the first rays of dawn filtered through the windows. The pantry door remained closed, but the sense of something watching them never faded. When Daniel finally mustered the courage to resecure the chain around the pantry, Emma begged him to leave. "This house isn't ours, Daniel. We need to go." "We can't just run," he replied, though his voice wavered. "We need to understand what's happening first." Emma didn't argue, but the unease in his eyes told her that Daniel wasn't as confident as he tried to appear. That evening, Emma decided to distract herself by cooking a lavish dinner. She needed a sense of normalcy, something to reclaim a bit of control. She set the table with care, using an old dinnerware set they'd found in one of the cabinets. Its edges were worn, but it felt right to use something familiar from the house. Daniel entered from the living room, the laptop tucked under his arm. "I've adjusted the cameras," he said. "If anything happens tonight, we'll see it clearly." Emma nodded absent-mindedly, focusing on the table. It was only when she stepped back that she noticed something was wrong. There were 4 plates set. She froze, the fork in her hand slipping to the floor with a sharp clang. "Daniel, did you set the table?" Daniel frowned. "No, I've been working on the cameras. Why?" Emma's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She didn't answer. Instead, she quickly removed the 2 extra plates, stuffing them back into the cabinet. Even as she closed the door, the unease lingered, like the shadows of unseen eyes watching from the corners of the room. They ate in near silence, the only sounds the clinking of silverware and the ticking of the wall clock. After dinner, Emma began washing the dishes while Daniel reviewed footage on the laptop. "Emma," Daniel called softly, his voice strained. "You need to see this." Drying her hands, Emma hurried to his side. On the screen, the camera from the living room replayed the previous night's events. A shadow emerged, clearer now than ever before. It moved with deliberate intent, hovering near the dining table before settling into a chair. Daniel paused the footage. "It's sitting at the table." Emma's stomach churned. The shadow remained still for a moment before disappearing into nothingness. The air between them felt heavier now, weighed down by an understanding they couldn't ignore. Daniel shut the laptop abruptly, his hands shaking. "We need help." The next morning, Emma contacted the local church. The priest who arrived was an elderly man with kind, weary eyes that seemed to have seen more than he let on. He brought a small vial of holy water and a worn prayer book. Moving through the house, he murmured prayers, sprinkling the holy water on walls and door frames. When he entered the kitchen, he stopped abruptly, his brow furrowing. "What is it?" Daniel asked, his voice tight with fear. The priest turned to them slowly. "There is something here. Not a spirit. Something older." Emma's breath hitched. "Can you get rid of it?" The priest hesitated, his gaze somber. "It isn't that simple. These entities are sometimes tied to the very foundation of a place. This house holds history, dark history. And if we leave," Daniel pressed, "it might follow you, or it might not. There's no guarantee." The priest's warning echoed in Emma's mind for the rest of the day. That night, they didn't bother watching the cameras. Neither wanted to see what the house might reveal at 3:17. Instead, they stayed awake together in the living room, surrounded by light. But even the brightest bulb couldn't dispel the growing darkness within the house. At some point in the night, Emma dozed off. Her dreams were filled with familiar shadows, 4 figures seated at the table, watching her with faces that shifted and dissolved like melting wax. When she woke, her heart was pounding, her throat tight with an unspoken scream. The clock read 3:17. The next morning, Emma moved as though in a daze, her mind lingering on the faceless figures from her dream. Daniel didn't speak much as he sipped his coffee, his face pale and drawn. The house seemed more oppressive than ever, its silence vibrating with unspoken menace. "We need answers," Emma said finally, breaking the stillness. "Who lived here before us? What happened in this house?" Daniel nodded reluctantly, though it was clear he shared her dread. They drove to the town's small library, its shelves heavy with records of local history. Hours passed as they sifted through property deeds and faded newspapers. Finally, Emma found an article buried in a stack of yellowed clippings. Her hands trembled as she read aloud. The article detailed the death of a man named Stephen Duarte, the house's previous owner. A recluse, Stephen had been found dead in the living room, surrounded by chalk-drawn symbols. The police dismissed it as a suicide, but neighbors claimed to have seen cloaked figures entering the house at odd hours. Strange chanting and muffled screams had reportedly echoed through the property for months before his death. Daniel's face tightened. "You think those symbols, they're still here?" Emma nodded, her throat dry. They returned to the house in silence, the article's weight settling heavily between them. As soon as they stepped inside, the air felt colder, heavier, as though the house itself was aware of what they had uncovered. Emma and Daniel began to search, moving furniture and peeling back old rugs. It didn't take long before they found it. A faint circular pattern etched into the wooden floor of the living room. Time had worn it down, but the markings were unmistakable. "It's a summoning circle," Emma whispered. Daniel's voice was tight. "Do you think it still works?" Emma didn't answer. She didn't need to. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, closing in around them. The sound of footsteps broke the silence. Clear, deliberate steps echoed from the kitchen, growing louder with each passing second. "Stay together," Daniel said, gripping Emma's hand tightly. They approached the kitchen slowly, each step a test of their courage. The space felt colder than before, the air so thick it was hard to breathe. The pantry door was open again. But this time, something moved inside. Daniel took a step closer, raising the flashlight, but its beam was swallowed by the darkness within the pantry. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice trembling. A low, guttural growl answered, a sound that was neither human nor animal. Emma grabbed Daniel's arm, pulling him back, and the pantry door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. They stumbled back into the living room, their breaths ragged. "This house doesn't want us here," Emma whispered. "And if we stay, it will only get worse." That night, Daniel and Emma sat in silence, their packed bags by the door. They didn't dare sleep. At 3:17 a.m., the cameras confirmed their worst fears. On the kitchen feed, 4 shadowy figures sat at the table. They didn't move, their forms impossibly dark, their faces blurred and shifting. One of them slowly turned its head, staring directly into the camera. Emma felt tears stream down her face as she watched. The figure raised a hand and pointed, not at the camera but at the pantry door behind it. On screen, the door creaked open, revealing nothing but inky blackness. The feed went dead. The next morning, Emma and Daniel were no longer the same. The fear, the knowing, had rooted itself in them like a parasite. They moved mechanically, packing their belongings with a frantic urgency, as though the house itself were watching, waiting for them to make a mistake. "Take only what we need," Daniel said, his voice strained. "The faster we leave, the better." Emma nodded, her mind barely registering his words. She was already focused on the door, on the final step out. But she couldn't shake the sense that something was holding them there, invisible hands keeping them from leaving. Every corner of the house seemed to tighten, as though the walls themselves were pushing in on them. The oppressive atmosphere made it difficult to breathe, each breath heavier than the last. Emma's eyes darted nervously around the room, her every instinct screaming for escape, but the weight of the house held them in place. As dusk fell, the air grew thick. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside, felt like the house itself was alive, watching, waiting for them to make the wrong move. At 3:17 a.m., the house came to life. Emma was in the kitchen, her back to the door as she loaded the last of their belongings into boxes. Suddenly, the unmistakable sound of chairs scraping against the floor reached her ears. She turned slowly, heart hammering in her chest. The kitchen table was set again, as if by invisible hands. The chairs were all filled by shadowed figures that had not been there moments before. They sat still, their faces blank slates of darkness. Emma froze. "Daniel!" she shouted, but her voice caught in her throat. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the figures, their presence too heavy, too real. Daniel rushed in, flashlight in hand, but when he saw the figures, his hand trembled, the light faltering in his grip. Who are you?" he demanded, his voice shaky. The shadows didn't respond. They simply sat, as though waiting for something. Slowly, one figure lifted its hand, and the others followed suit. It was a slow, deliberate movement that seemed to drain the room of any remaining warmth. "They want something from us," Emma whispered, her voice cracking. "Let's leave now," Daniel urged, grabbing her hand. They both bolted toward the door, but when Daniel tried to turn the handle, it wouldn't budge. He tried again, more desperately this time, but the door remained shut. "Open it!" Emma screamed. "We have to get out!" But the door refused to move. The air around them thickened, heavier now, as if the house had become a prison that had no intention of letting them go. A deep, inhuman voice suddenly echoed through the room, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You cannot leave." The walls seemed to close in on them, the air growing colder by the second. The shadows in the kitchen didn't move, but Emma could feel them, pressing in on them, suffocating them. Each figure stood as still as death, but their presence was undeniable, suffocating. The temperature dropped, the darkness deepening. The lights flickered once and then went out, plunging them into pitch black. Suddenly, the pantry door creaked open, and the sound of slow, deliberate steps echoed from within. They were not footsteps made by any living creature. They were the sound of something ancient, something waiting to claim them. Daniel backed away, his eyes wild with panic. What do we do? But Emma already knew. She remembered the words the priest had said, the warnings he'd given. "This house," she whispered, barely able to form the words. "It never wanted us. It never has. We're just visitors here." The house shifted, as though breathing in the same air they were, feeding off their fear. "The house belongs to them," Emma said, voice trembling. "They've always been here. They've always owned this place." As if in response, the shadows at the table stirred, rising slowly to their feet. The temperature dropped even further. The figures began to move toward them. Emma could feel the pressure in the room intensifying, the weight of the house's past crushing them, dragging them deeper into its grip. "We have to go," Daniel cried out, but there was no way out. They were trapped, caught between the living world and something far darker. Suddenly, the lights flickered again and went out completely. The door, which had been locked tight moments before, creaked open with a low, groaning sound. The shadows didn't hesitate. They moved as one, gliding silently toward the open door. For a moment, Emma and Daniel just stood there, hearts racing, staring at the dark figures moving toward freedom. The house, it seemed, was finally letting them go. With no time to think, they grabbed their bags and ran. Every step felt like wading through tar, but finally they reached the front door. It swung open with a groan, and they ran into the cold night air, desperate for freedom. They didn't look back as they sped away in their car, but as they glanced through the rearview mirror, Emma thought she saw something, movement in the windows. Shadows, watching, waiting. "They let us go," Daniel whispered. "They didn't stop us." Emma didn't answer. She knew the truth. The house had never been theirs to leave. It was always theirs to claim. And as they drove down the winding road, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows hadn't let them go at all. If this story gave you chills, don't forget to like and subscribe. More terrifying tales are coming your way. What would you have done in their place? Share your thoughts in the comments below.